Testing, 1, 2, testing. Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
All right, I hear you. Can I get a mic check?
I can hear you as well.
All right, cool. I'm hearing both of you guys.
Great, thank you.
I know you're fine. Hi, nice to meet you.
Oh, you're my seat partner.
Okay, yeah, I know. I was like, there's lots to discuss.
Yes.
We'll get to it. We're gonna hear something.
Yes, exactly.
Know each other better than anyone. I'm making like a lot of eye contact.
I know. Feel a little overwhelmed already.
Yeah, we love it.
I like this.
No one ever wants to sit in the front.
Yeah, no, I'm actually a little impressed. But I would have been in the back.
Yeah.
I can hear just as well from back there. So
I know. I was like, I also can talk really loudly,
Yeah.
so I never need a mic.
yeah.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome tonight to the Washington Leadership Program, the first of our series for the summer 2024. My name is Colby Kyo. I'm CAPAL's board chair, and I'm very pleased to be your moderator tonight. First, I want to thank our wonderful staff, Shama and Hannah, who have put together, worked very hard on this program and all of our programs this summer. Thank you so much. Our panelists, who both on screen and in person today, who are alumni of the program, and to all of you for coming out tonight. I think we're getting that first session warm jitters out. We have 5 more to go. I want to see this crowd at each of those, and I want you to help spread out the word for those. But tonight, what we're here for is the Washington Leadership Program. It is an anchor program for CAPAL. CAPAL, the Conference on Asian Pacific American Leadership. We are an organization that helps cultivate Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And we're putting them in public service opportunities and putting them on a public service pathway. This looks like what we're doing tonight, a speaker series that's going to last throughout the summer. It looks like a roundtable series with senior professionals in Washington, D.C. and beyond. There's a mentorship program. But the anchor of this is a scholarship and internship program. And this summer, we're very lucky to have 29 phenomenal scholars and interns from across the United States. I think some are here tonight. You want to out yourselves a little bit? Yeah, there we go. Every guy a little louder than that. Yeah. Caleb. Yeah, thank you, Caleb. Okay. But we are also really much a community that has been around now into our 35th year. That consists of alumni that come from our founding members to today. And that's alumni from our scholars and interns that are in the audience and watching online, but also folks that have volunteered for us on our board. So I'm really excited about that. I'm really ecstatic that tonight's session, all the sessions have been brought together by the minds of our alumni. So the folks that planned and chose, what we'd be talking about were alumni of the program. And tonight, I think I mentioned everyone is an alum of some sort, and we'll get to them shortly. Tonight's session, political literacy, an introduction to public service. We're going to discuss, how to keep yourself politically literate, particularly in times that are pretty turbulent, that are very difficult, that I think we wake up every day and we're like, what is happening, and how do I continue to push on and plug in and do so in community? We're also going to talk about, what are the different pathways in public service? I think a lot of us come to Washington or come to these spaces and have an idea of, I want to work for Congress. I want to work for the State Department. That is how I'm going to change the world. And then many of us who have been around for many years have found ourselves in many, 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 many different places. And so I'm really excited to hear from our panelists who each come from a very different background currently, but also have had a journey onto their own that has been really interesting. There's going to be an audience survey. And the reason that is important is we want to hear your feedback because that's going to help inform future programming. But also it's proof that you were here and to show our really good friends at the mayor's office that people are attending our programs, that our programs are interesting and they're worth supporting. So I need you to stick around for that. So again, thank you to our speakers and panelists. Thank you for following along online for everybody. And I think I'm going to hand this off to Hannah to kick us off with a bit of an audience activity.
All right, perfect. Can everybody hear me? Pretty okay? All right, perfect. So before we start the panel discussion, we wanted to do a quick 10-minute audience activity. So we're going to poll the audience using Menti. And since this panel is really centered around public service, we really want to hear from you guys. What does public service mean to you? You can scan the QR code. You can use the bit.ly link or go to menti.com and enter in the code below. We'll also be handing out sheets on the side that has the join info as well. So raise your hand if you would like an actual sheet that has the information to join, and we'll hand it over to you. So we'll give folks 5 minutes to fill out the poll, and then we'll see the results of what everyone has to say.
I figured, yeah.
Okay, can I get a thumbs up if everyone's filled it out? Anyone need a little bit more time? Okay, perfect. So let me go ahead and pull up the results. All right, so these are the results that everyone shared. It seems like overwhelmingly community was a really big one that people associated with public service. We also see that advocacy is really big, representation, compassion, dedication, government, selfless, justice. So really interesting to see all the crossover, but also all the different responses that you guys put down as well. I also see volunteering, creating impact, activism, which is really amazing. Oh, there was one more question about where you get your news sources from, but seeing as no one filled it out, maybe we can quickly pull the room. So raise your hand if you get your news sources from CNN or any other like mainstream news media sources. Show of hands. Okay, so most of you, how about Facebook? Anyone get it from Facebook? No. One lone for, okay. What about TikTok? Okay, quite a few from TikTok. Very interesting. New York Times, local news. Okay, Instagram. Very interesting. So with that in mind, thank you all for participating, and I will toss it back to Colby.
All right. Thank you, Hannah, very much. Thank you, audience. Oh, some people did participate. Look at that. All right. All right. Thank you, audience, for participating. So the reason we want to do that is just to get a sense of like who's in the room, what you guys value. And I think we as panelists and online and here tonight can be a little bit responsive to that as we're going through. But first, let's do a bit of a welcome and let's let everyone introduce themselves. I have a really nice panel for you. I'm going to start online, and maybe Isha, if you'll start, and then Jeremiah, we'll go to you, and then we'll come to the folks in the room. So Isha, over to you.
Great. Thanks, Colby. Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? Okay, fabulous. That's like half the battle of doing hybrid presentations and panels, so we're already there. It's so nice to be with all of you virtually. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person today. It worked out better because I'm a little under the weather anyway, so I'm sparing you some germs. But my name is Isha Bhave. I use she, her pronouns. I had the pleasure and joy of being a CAPAL board member from 2016 to 2019, and I see fellow board member Mary there in person, so it's nice to see you, Mary. For my day job, I am working as a program officer on the Gender and Reproductive Equity grant-making team at a private family foundation called the Schusterman Family Philanthropies. So a little bit of a non-traditional experience, I would say, in public service, but certainly connected to and working on issues that are really relevant to policy and advocacy, and taking a little bit of a different approach. So excited to share that with you all, and thank you, CAPAL, for the invitation.
Thank you, Isha. Jeremiah?
Hey everyone, my name is Jeremiah and I am a 2019 CAPAL scholar. I did my CAPAL internship with the State Department in DC. And then after graduating a year later, I stayed with the State Department. I'm now in the Foreign Service as what's called a diplomatic technology officer, based in Mumbai, India. And I've served in the UAE, that was my last tour, Germany and Turkmenistan, but I'm originally from DC area. So super glad to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremiah. And don't take an offense when I was dunking on State earlier. State's great. Yeah. Really proud to have you here. Okay, over to Mary.
Hi, it's nice to see you too, Isha. So Isha and I served on the CAPAL board around the same time. So it's already been 6 years, and at the time just flew by. But I most recently was a project manager for Asian American and Pacific Islander strategy at AARP on their diversity and inclusion team. And they're a large nonprofit that deals with aging issues, and they work on a lot of issues for adults 50 and over, but also their families. And for the past 10 years, I've been in DC, mostly doing communications roles for a variety of API nonprofits, small to bigger.
Awesome. Over to Reba.
Hi, everyone. It's so good to see you all, and it's really good to be here. I was a CAPAL intern in the summer of 2017. I was interning at the Senate Subcommittee on Federal Spending Oversight and something else, which I've already forgotten. I am now at the National Partnership for Women and Families. I'm a senior executive administrator and research manager, which is so many words and really just means that I report directly to the president of our organization, Jocelyn Fry, who's incredible. And if she has a question, I try to answer it. And so I've had a couple of think tanky advocacy jobs leading up to it. And now I've been here for around a year and a half.
Excellent. Tao.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tao Tran, and I've had about 15 years in federal government, working first for the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, then for Department of Interior, and then for Department of State. And literally 3 weeks ago, I just transferred over to the Department of Treasury. So I've been in both a foreign service and civil service roles, serving overseas in Egypt, Uganda, Philippines, and Germany as well. And then I know, yeah, just for my current job, it's only been 3 weeks, but a lot of federal government, as you'll come to find out, some things are very similar and some things are completely new. So I'm still learning as I go along. So maybe I'll be able to tell you in a couple of months what my job actually entails.
And you're heading to Colombia next.
And I'm heading to Colombia next. So I met my husband overseas in Egypt. And so we've been trying to do this dual career thing. And so I literally came back from Germany, like I said, 3 weeks ago for him to learn Spanish. And then once he passes his test, hopefully we'll head to Colombia in August.
Met my husband in Egypt. Casual. Do you and Jeremiah know each other? I mean, it's a big federal world and you're both in state centric or state.
I don't think so,
Yeah.
We're
but it's
gonna
nice to be here and meet everybody.
All right. And yeah, Colby Keough, your moderator tonight, board chair, worked in Congress for a few years, worked here at UC-DC for the University of California here in Washington, DC for a few years. And the last 5 years have been with a group called FGS Global. We're a big public affairs firm. I mostly do work in the Middle East with UAE. We're going to talk UAE later, Jeremiah, and Turks and Caicos and Special Olympics. So panel, you told us kind of what you're doing, but what do you actually do, right? These are really big. These are really like big titles, big organizations. I think I'm interested to unpacking a little bit like what that means to folks who are just coming to DC and like recognize state, recognize aid. And this crew I know is like, you know, levels of education above that. So you're even more familiar, but I'm curious like your day to day, what that looks like, the exciting bits, maybe the not exciting bits, and just like how you found that experience in public service. And maybe I'll start with Jeremiah since I'm making fun of him a lot, and then we'll circle around.
So my formal title is called Diplomatic Technology Officer. Just a fancy way of saying that I work on the tech side of the State Department at our consulates and embassies overseas. And so what I do is I help administer sorry, my dog. I help administer the IT side and work with communications, emergency communications at all of those, at our presence overseas. So for example, think of it like think of how like a school nurse works with a school in that their patients are the students. Well, we're the tech side, not at the Googles and the Microsofts of the world, but instead the larger, again, American presence in the form of consulates and embassies overseas. So we only service our consulates and embassies overseas. We don't work on the IT side for helping non-American organizations. Instead, we're there primarily to make sure that all of our telecommunications, our security, cybersecurity, our, again, IT parts all function so that our colleagues who are in the political, economic, management, facilities, and literally everyone else who's considered diplomat at our consulates and embassies overseas, we help them make sure they have the tools and the technical tools to do their job. And as a diplomatic technology officer, I rotate every 2 to 3 years. In fact, I'm bidding this year for my next assignment to depart next year. So that's where I am, and what I've been doing since I graduated in 2020, and then what I sort of did in my CAPAL internship as well.
Nice. Nice. Yeah, those worldwide assignments, that's like it's a big draw for a lot of folks. That's awesome. Someone else who's used to worldwide assignments, Tal, coming to you. You've been at state, you've been at aid, you've been at interior, you've been at treasury now. What are maybe some of the differences between those and like some of the functions that you've done day to day?
Sure. So I will say that I've been a little bit of a chameleon in the work that I do because I've done kind of budget work, I've done like policy work, I've done programs management work. And so I think one of the great things about public service and the federal government, from my experience, is that you can move into some of these roles. And so I actually came with a business administration degree. And it's, you know, one of the few that I was able to choose because I didn't want to be a lawyer, engineer, or doctor. And so I said, well, business administration has probably the most versatile background. And so not knowing that I was going to go into the federal government, I just thought I would go work for a corporation somewhere. But once I did land into the federal government, I discovered that I could actually apply a lot of those skill sets to a lot of the work that we do. And so I think, you know, the way that things work differently is that each government agency or department, right, has their own particular mission and purpose, but the bureaucracy is still there. So really understanding the framework behind how things work is always like the main key to, I think, being flexible and understanding how to apply yourself in different industries. So even though I say, federal government, each experience is actually very unique because USAID, only works in the global South mostly. State Department, has obviously a much wider reach, but they do very different things with a very different perspective. And so for those who are interested in international affairs, people always hear about Department of State, and I like state for its own purpose, but I'll also put out there that if you want to do international affairs, there's so much work in other areas that you can be in. And there's foreign service in USAID, there's foreign service in commerce, there's foreign service in agriculture. And so I would say, don't limit yourself to just one particular area because there's really rewarding and rich work across all sectors of the federal government.
Yeah, thank you, Tao. There's also like really interesting work. I hadn't thought about this before. I was more familiar with it, like on the private side too, not trying to pull folks from there, but you're public service adjacent by like advising these groups and doing public affairs work. We'll dig into that later though. Really quick, I think just a mechanic, everyone move their mics a little bit closer to yourself and just, yeah, maybe the center of the table, and we should be good, and just try to match my cadence a little bit. There we go with the voice. Okay. So let's move outside of the federal government. I'm going to move over to Isha. Isha, I don't think I've heard about the Schusterman Family Philanthropies, and you've described it as a private family foundation, kind of non-traditional. Can you speak to that? I think a lot of folks are maybe also unfamiliar and could learn something.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've been at Schusterman Family Philanthropies for about 4 years, which is as old as the portfolio that I work on is, which again is the Gender and Reproductive Equity grant making portfolio. So just like a little bit of philanthropy 101, there are lots of different types of foundations, everything from grant making, private family foundations, which is where I work, to some of the more institutional foundations that you all may have heard of or be more familiar with, like the Ford Foundation or the Carnegie Mellon Foundation, that also run and operate their own grant-making programs, typically from an endowment. And they're pulling a certain amount of their budget to then invest in nonprofits based on a particular strategy. And so that those are two. And then the third would be sort of family foundations that are operating foundations or just running programs, but not necessarily making grants. So I actually came from an operating foundation, which was the Clinton Foundation. So they didn't have a really robust grant making budget, but I joked that they banked on the Clinton name in that they could bring together lots of different stakeholders and pursue issue advocacy based on previous experience or carry forward legacy programs from President Bill Clinton's tenure. So those are sort of like the different foundation spaces. My day-to-day in this particular grant-making foundation as a program officer is really a few different things, but first and foremost, I see myself as an advocate for a lot of our grantee partners that we fund and invest in. So we invest in 501c3, so the traditional nonprofit organizations, and then also 501c4, which are a little more of the political electoral types of organizations across the US to advance gender and reproductive equity. For us, that includes abortion access and reproductive health, addressing gender and mitigating gender-based violence, building out the care economy, and then also growing women's political power, and in particular representation in elected office at the state and national level. So all of the grant making that I do, which again is investing this family's money into a strategy that me and my team have built and designed in service of policy outcomes and organizing outcomes. And I just want to name Ariba that, and you may already know this, that the National Partnership for Women and Families is one of our grantee partners, just given the broad scope of work around reproductive health and economic justice. So it's very cool also to see and have that overlap in personal experience and then the professional experience as well. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Isha. I was curious if there was going to be a connection or circular part of your work. So I'll go over to Ariba to talk about what the National Partnership for Women and Families is up to and the type of work you do.
Yeah, so we try to do the thing that Isha's interested in funding, which is trying to get paid leave passed, trying to think about the gender wage gap, trying to think about abortion, trying to think about democracy and women, and trying to put all these things together. So there's a lot of different pieces to the work that our organization does. And what my role is, it's a little bit unique because I get to dabble in everything, which is something I really enjoy. I've never been someone who has like one issue that's the only issue I want to think about. The thing that's most interesting to me has always been how everything is connected. So I'm really grateful to be in a position where I can do that, and think about the ways that we can use the advocacy and research skills that exist at the National Partnership to push our narrative, to get our research out there, and to start, doing some forward thinking about, in 2 years, in 3 years, what are we going to need to make sure that everyone can have an abortion when they want one, right? Like, that's really important. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It requires some kind of strategy, or it requires coalition work, but it also requires bringing in different organizations that might not be traditionally thinking about abortion in that way, or thinking about reproductive justice in a bigger umbrella. So that's a lot of the work that I get to do because I work in what we call the president's office. A lot of the work that I do is writing things that will then go out under our president's name, and trying to push some portfolios that we don't necessarily have someone dedicated to at our organization to like focus a ton on. So we've got a new portfolio that we're working on that puts together democracy and abortion access, and is essentially looking at the ways that voting rights across states or state legislatures and things like that are barriers to women being able to use their political and electoral power, to just tell people they want abortions again in their states. And that's like a very specific pushback to the Dobbs decision. And so of course what I really like about the work is I have my own obvious perspective and values that drive me. And I feel really grateful to be in a role where I get to use those values every day, and I get to learn something more about how to advance the vision that I have for the world. And so I think that's what I really like about being in the advocacy and the think tank space, is that that's very much that is our goal. And even when we kind of disagree amongst us, or when we have pushback, a lot of us, we are all there because we kind of share a vision for the world we're trying to create. And I think there's a lot of ways to do that. So I was at a couple different think tank organizations before that, focusing on poverty work. So I started at the Center for American Progress right out of college. And I worked on our poverty team for 3 years. And then I was at the Georgetown Center for Poverty and Inequality doing more policy analysis there, focused on SNAP and market power and all these things. And then I moved over here. So I think my career path, the thing that I really appreciate about it is that I have a very specific perspective on the world, and I don't really like pretending like I don't. So it's nice that I don't have to.
Yeah, I particularly appreciate like you're naming mission, vision, and values as like driving the choices you're making in your career. And I think particularly when we think about public service, it's a much easier match to find, right? Like as far as when we're trying to figure out what motivates us, it's easier to find mission, vision, values alignment often on that side of things. Okay, Mary, over to you.
So at ARP, it's also a variety of things that I get to do, especially with my communications background. And a lot of it is internal and external education. So within ARP itself, there are so many departments that we have to educate about what would be culturally relevant to the API community. One example of this that was more on the fun side is there's a movies department that screens movies. So sometimes I get to watch movies for fun and see if the themes align with what ARP gets to put out there, either virtual or online screening. And then for other departments, it includes research. So what is the types of research related to APIs? Like that could be caregiving, it could be how many APIs are business owners, and these are all really important ways to learn more about how we can serve API communities within a large nonprofit. And then when I was doing more of the communications work, it would be a lot of things like pitching stories to journalists. I did a lot of work around anti-Asian hate, especially right after the pandemic. So we would collect people's stories, and one of some of the most meaningful work during that time period was just listening to people feel more empowered to share, even if they felt like what they were experiencing was very small. And then we were able to then pitch those stories to major media outlets. And if we're getting more into the nitty-gritty of what the reality of day to day is, sometimes remote work does get a little bit challenging or repetitive over time, but what makes it more interesting is if you really are engaged in the work and the people that you work with. So meeting with them about what do you need, or what's exciting about communications is you get to dip your toes into a variety of different areas. So I would meet with the immigration team about what kind of communications projects do you need? Do you need a social media campaign? For like the technology department too, what are the policies or bills that are going to come up, and how can we pressure people like representatives to care about what APIs care about? So that's just a little sample of what I've worked on.
Yeah, and I also appreciate that within a very large organization, I recently learned like AARP has like thousands of employees that are located in DC, that you work and support, the API community within that, right? I feel like that's something that probably, I don't know, maybe the last decade has continued to grow, but is getting a lot more prominence these days. And so I feel like you're kind of ahead of the curve in that type of work. All right, so we've talked a little bit about like what everyone does. And so I think the next kind of important question when I think about this is why? Like, why did you make this decision to go into public service? Maybe not this particular job, but like what was kind of your origin story? What first inspired you or drew you to this work? And I'm going to kick off with Jeremiah.
Yeah, so when I originally started my whole public service, like I forayed into public service as an intern, I originally was not in STEM. I graduated eventually in STEM. I think I drank the Kool-Aid. I really wanted to go into diplomacy from the non-tech side, but then I ended up switching over, coming into the tech side later on. And that's because I really saw my interest aligning with like the values of democracy and looking into how, like our presence outside of the United States, and to see how we can sort of build and forge different types of relationships with other countries overseas in a very broad way. When I was in college, CAPAL definitely helped with that. And then I got into like formally public service after graduation through what's called the Foreign Affairs IT Fellowship. The Foreign Affairs IT Fellowship. Some of you might be familiar with the Pickering or the Rangel or the Payne fellowships into the Foreign Service. Mine is the same concept. My fellowship, it's new. It was just created. I think we're only I was only in the second cohort, but I think we just admitted our eighth cohort. And so it's the same concept in that we had the living expenses and tuition covered in exchange for a 5-year contractual obligation to the department. So think of it like ROTC, right? Where your tuition was paid for and you had summer internships and board and lodging and all that in exchange for a job after we finish our studies. So I highly recommend that, because this just tells you that there's money available into diplomacy, both at the undergraduate and graduate level.
Good name drops across the board. Pickering, you get the Payne, you have this fellowship, and then you mentioned CAPAL. So plus points for Jeremiah today. Plus points. Who wants to go next? Why? What's your why?
I can go next.
Please.
I think I already started it a little bit in the last answer. I grew up in Southeast Michigan, which is a very kind of segregated place, and there's a lot. It's very obvious when you live there. I think that people's experiences are really determined by their class and by their race, and of course all the other markers, but I think those are the ones that are most obvious. I feel like I switched schools a lot when I was younger, and I kept noticing, I was like, why, like some schools are better, some schools are worse. Like I don't change at any of these, but like the experiences that I'm getting do. And I think for me that sparked an initial curiosity in like, why is that? And at first I was right. Like I was like, oh, okay, what's going on with schools? And then I started thinking in Michigan, like housing is a big thing. There's a big history of redlining and housing segregation. And Michigan is very much like an epicenter for a lot of that. And so I kind of started thinking about that. I was really lucky. I had some teachers in high school who really supported us doing some of that research. So I just got really curious. And then to go to college, and I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know who I am or what I like or anything. And so honestly, just logistically, so I went to the University of Michigan, and the University of Michigan has a School of Public Policy that you apply to in your second year of the undergrad, and then you do it for your third and fourth year there. And I was like, I don't know what's going on, so I guess that gives me some time. And if I get in, then great. And if I don't get in, then I'll just do something else. And so honestly, like that little pocket of time of being able to decide and take some classes really helped me. I ended up getting into that Ford School and doing my undergrad there. And it was just a really useful way to explore some of the issues that I was interested in. And I feel like I've always been kind of like an issues and value driven person and wasn't totally sure what my skill set was within that. And so I think then the next step for me was trying to figure out how to get the right skills so I could work on the things I cared about. And then, if those things shifted, then they would shift. But that's kind of the context and the framing that I had when I started. Then I was unemployed after I graduated. And I was like, oh no, here we go, another crisis. And so I was looking at jobs. I was thinking DC because I had done the CAPAL internship and kind of decided, oh, okay, like Congress is interesting. I'm not sure if it's 100% what I want to do. And the offices I was interested in didn't necessarily have openings and the salaries were kind of tough. And so I was kind of thinking it through and I got really lucky and I found this job at the Center for American Progress on their poverty team. And the role there, it was very much an entry-level role, but the thing that I'll always be grateful for about it was that it let me really dabble in a lot of different things and decide that I do like some of the research. I like being able to go down a rabbit hole and I really like writing. And I knew that when I was in college, so I had a minor in writing, but I didn't know how to use that outside of like being a journalist or being something like that. And so I feel like that first job was really a very useful way for me to dabble in some different kinds of skills and decide how I really want to spend the 40 hours a week we do doing all this. But through all of it, I think trying to stay not necessarily like the values that you bring into college or in high school or that you learn when you're young are the correct ones, right? Or the ones that you should stick with always. But I think that sense of curiosity is something that I really found helpful as I was trying to figure out my career. And I've tried now to pivot towards like, what are the things that are most interesting to me that are happening in the world? So if I see something going on with abortion, I'm like, that's actually really interesting to me. What are the dynamics here? What can be done? What's going on with Black women in the economy? Like those are questions that are interesting to me. So I've been really lucky and I try really hard to pivot to the things that I find interesting when I can. And I think that really helps.
Yeah, values, community, big drivers. And you also mentioned CAPAL again, so plus points. All right, who's next?
I
Tao.
can go because I think mine echoes a little bit of what you were saying. And so I always say that I entered the public service more as a way to rebel against my parents. But I think a lot of it really has to do with the fact that they taught me the values that I think rooted me to that kind of career. And so I was born in Vietnam. We immigrated over when I was young. So I'm part of the 1.5 generation where you're first generation, but you're still kind of you're dabbling in both cultures. And so there was always a high distrust of the government. So that was never, ever in my career pathway because they just would never think that, they want their dollar working for the government. And so as I mentioned before, I entered business administration because it was the most, versatile option that I saw. And so I went through the whole thing. I got a job offer, with PricewaterhouseCoopers to graduate after graduation. And I think I went through a bit of a quarter life crisis where I said, I'm about to enter the world and I don't really know that I want this job. I don't really know what I want to do. And, we grew up like really poor. We were on food stamps. We were like, scraping by, living together with, 10 people in the house. And so I think I was always driven by same like kind of curiosity about, if I'm given the privilege to do something more, should I just be going to do what everyone else is doing? Or can I apply my skills to do something that's more interesting and purposeful and matters to me, right? And so what I kind of assessed was that what I really enjoyed during college was not so much the course curriculum in business, even though that gave me obviously really good skill set, but it was the volunteer work I did. It was, the relationships and activities I built throughout that time. It was the travels and cultures that I experienced during that time. And so I took a big leap and traumatized my parents by declining my very good full-time offer with PricewaterhouseCoopers and took a position in rural Nigeria working for an international health clinic, making $1,000 a month. So instead of being, the stable, American dream type of future that
We're good.
that my parents, like had envisioned for me, I went and, like worked in rural Nigeria, setting up telemedicine clinics. And they They cried. I cried. It was a huge fight. And I had to try to explain to them what happiness meant. And I realized that they have always been in survival mode and never realized that when you get to a point when you do feel safe and secure, thanks to their hard work, you are able to think about what makes you happy and what you want your work to mean to you. And so that's kind of the value I've been, going after since then, is to kind of do work that matters to me and that I'm proud to talk about. And so, I was able to do that and make less money, but then I went to the foreign service and made more money.
Yeah.
And they were a little happier, and I'm still, kind of climbing through the ranks. But I really had to, tell them that were the values that they instilled in me, is that if I'm in a position where I'm better off, then I should be helping others reach that same level of progress. And that's, something that I think finally did resonate with them, but it took, 10, 15 years and still ongoing.
Mm. It's reminding me of when we did the word cloud earlier. A lot of people put compassion, right, and what they think of public service, and that story. Thank you for sharing, Tao. Really, I think reflects that compassion and that community. Okay, let's go over to Mary, and then we'll go to Isha.
Sure. So I didn't know what public service was until I started my career, but I did know two things growing up, and one was that my parents were immigrants. So my dad always talked about the discrimination he faced at work and not being promoted and getting called names and slurs. And I used to just not really pay attention because he kept repeating these stories to his friends, anyone who could hear him every day at home. And then later on, it started to rile me up. Like, I started to think, this shouldn't really happen to anybody just because of where they grew up or came from. And then another thing that really bothered me growing up was I really liked reading magazines, newspapers, watching the news, but I never saw Filipinos or Asian Americans represented in the news. So it felt like national issues that weren't happening to us, and that led us to being more of an invisible minority or population. So later on, when I became interested in doing more around journalism, I made sure to cover stories about Filipinos and the API community as a whole. And that's guided me ever since, because it's opened up a lot of different pathways and a lot of different areas. And I've been, over the past 10 years, I've been able to see the growth from the media not covering APIs at all to now you can't ignore us politically or otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, that's so true. Like, representation sometimes only happens if you are the representation, right? And if you're willing to, whether we call it risk or like take the chance, take that big step in order to create pathways for other folks to follow, create a model for folks to follow. That's great. Thanks for sharing. Isha?
Thank you. This is super inspiring. And one sort of different facet I think that I'll talk about is just the power of mentors along the way that can really help shape your own, certainly helped shape my career trajectory. One of my first internships in college was actually with the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So a different iteration, a different time. And I really credit like my trajectory from there on out. And even frankly, that internship was something that my college advisor had said, well, what about this? Why don't you use this as an exploring option to see if public service is something that you're interested in? And so I think staying really curious, like Ariba said, and being open to finding really good mentors that will sort of lead you or just provide support as you explore from one opportunity to the next. So I started at the White House Initiative. I followed a mentor into federal government, and actually that opened the doors to other aspects of public service. So I've also worked in the nonprofit sector. And from there, given the issue areas that I was working on around gender justice, and in particular gender-based violence, I landed at a foundation that was actually making grants in that space, which for those of you who may not know is quite rare. To have a dedicated program around gender and reproductive health that's focusing on the US. And so I really credit a lot of those mentors, some of whom I still stay in touch with, some who have sort of showed up when I needed them, and I was able to cultivate a really meaningful relationship at the time and learn and absorb a lot. And hopefully, I'm passing some of that along to other students or younger folks that I work with. So I think that is a really valuable asset, and I know CAPAL too was a space for building a lot of those relationships as well.
Another Paul mentioned. There we go. And we do have a mentorship program that I believe our scholars and interns are getting oriented around, and just really want to encourage you to dive in, follow up with your mentors. If they're not responsive to you, they're busy, but follow up and make the most of that experience. And follow up with them after your time here with us. I'm still in touch with my mentees from like 2 years ago, and we still, link up and stuff like that. Okay, I'm gonna make a bit of a transition, and we're gonna come back to something you were talking about, Mary, which is, I think, representation in news media, but also one of the themes tonight was how do we stay, I think, politically literate? How do we stay informed in a time where there's a lot of information, there's a lot of misinformation, times are tenuous, there's a lot of different views. So I think, I don't need to, the whole panel doesn't need to respond. If you'd like to, we can do that, but I'll start with Mary. I will go to Tao, and then I'll open up to anyone else who wants to comment on that. So the question again is like, if you have comments about representation in media, but also kind of how you navigate your consumption of news to stay, up to speed on the world.
Yeah, news consumption has gotten increasingly overwhelming because there's so much out there. There's also so much on social media that's spread. And I think to keep it more accessible to you, it's important to know what's going on and important to realize that all politics is local. So follow your local media, which is also kind of concerning because a lot of it is being consolidated or dying out. But what I like to do every day, I get newsletters like City Paper, Axios DC, and another DC newsletter. You can ask me for recommendations later if you want. And I think it's also important to stay in tune with your grassroots community. So yes, you can read all the news you can, but what is really happening in your own neighborhood is important. So get involved in an organization or even attend one of the council meetings to see what are the concerns of the community, because once you actually talk face to face with people, whether they're your neighbors or just general people in the community, I think what's overwhelming becomes more accessible or real.
So I was really happy to see not too many people raise their hand for saying that they get their news from social media, because it's such a
There were a lot of TikTok hands.
There were a lot
of TikTok hands.
But it's at least, it wasn't like everyone. So just to say, so I did do a lot of work on misinformation, disinformation in an overseas environment. And it's such like a fascinating topic because it's something that's really hard to combat. And it's really more about you taking media literacy classes and really understanding critically where news come from and the varying levels of misinformation that is out there. And it doesn't have to be, deliberate. So misinformation is, just information that's, inaccurate or false, and disinformation has the intent behind it to, deliberately defraud or mislead. But both are dangerous because I think it just creates this environment where things become so politically biased that people don't fathom to think that there is another side to that story. And I tell that because there was a recent poll from this organization called YouGov that talks about, what the most reliable news source is to Americans. And the number one answer is the Weather Channel, because it's that politically biased and disparate. But what that means is that for me, if you want to stay politically literate, you have to understand what the other side is saying and what those important talking points are. So the more that we kind of listen to our echo chamber, the harder it is for us to entertain, different viewpoints, and to also understand how to build arguments against something that you think is inaccurate. And so, like it kills me sometimes, yes, to read like really inaccurate reporting from Fox News or whatever else, but you also have to make yourself aware that they exist. And in my private capacity with Department of State, I was the spokesperson for the consulate, and I was in public diplomacy, which meant a combination of both working on the cultural side with, really fun things like going to see authors and dance groups and art museums and whatnot. But the other side is press and media. And what that means is that we were crafting the narratives and messages for how we present foreign policy overseas. But it also means engaging with journalists in a way that, we understand what narratives are being told out there. And it's just fascinating to see, because I've done that both in the United States and overseas, and everyone has an agenda. So it doesn't matter that if it's a major outlet. When a journalist comes to you, most of the time they do have an agenda because there's a story they want to tell. And some things are complicated in a way that it's hard to explain to get the facts out there. And nuance makes all the difference. So if someone who is a journalist can't get to that level of understanding, they'll publish what is the most easily accessible information. And it's tough, but that's why you just have to be aware of what the environment is like and do your own research and really just read a variety of news sources and try to really ground truth, what is out there. But also, tap into your community. So if something is happening, and an expert or someone within your CAPAL network or elsewhere, tap into that and ask them those questions about where you can get more news sources and where you can learn more about the topic, because there is so much information out there, but they're not always accurate or objective. So
Thanks.
I'll get off my soapbox.
No, that was great, Sal. I didn't know what to expect, but that's very you. Other weigh-ins from our panelists in regards to consuming news media and how you navigate that?
I can go really quick. I can't
Sure.
tell if people on the Zoom are trying to talk.
You're good.
But as someone who spends a lot of time on TikTok, I feel like
This is the response to the TikTok slander that happened.
yeah, which is actually, no, I'm joking. It should not be your sole and only source, obviously. But I do think that there's something to be said for taking a moment to click back to what places are citing as their sources, especially now that I work in research. I feel like there are so many moments where, a journalist will cite a study, and most of the time they're right. They're understanding the study correctly, right, it's not an issue. But sometimes you'll click back and you'll be like, oh, the study was only looking at a very specific town in Texas. So actually, maybe it's not representative of everyone everywhere and should not be used as the sole basis for opinion making or policy making, right? And I think that just because it's in something that is supposed to be very credible does not necessarily mean, like you were saying earlier, that the story is complete. And sometimes you have to use your judgment to decide whether something is missing. I think that's part of reading through any of these narratives, is recognizing it's not just, oh, what's the other side saying? It's more of what assumptions are baked into this. So when I was doing the poverty work, one of the big things that we were working on was thinking about narrative change. And of course, that's partly because we have an agenda, as everyone else does, and we have things that we think matter. But part of what we were trying to do was say, okay, when we write this report, if we want journalists to cover it, we actually want to frame this report with an understanding that actually maybe our baseline is that nobody should be poor. Maybe our baseline is that, we want to be pushing back against this idea of deserving and undeserving poor. And there are ways that you can do that in the language that you use and the research that we're producing. And there's effect then in how we can not necessarily ask, but how we can push journalists to cover it. And so I remember when I was working on that narrative change, we had a conversation with a reporter at Vox who was thinking of doing a video series on the child tax credit, and she had one idea for the story, and then we gave her a bunch of research and a bunch of ideas and said, hey, actually the thing that's actually at the root of a lot of this is these really racist ideas that certain people deserve help and certain people don't. And let's think about that, right? And I think part of what is interesting about being able to be in public service, no matter what kind of job you have, is that you do kind of have an opportunity to think more deeply about what assumptions are baked into the news that you're reading, and seeing who are the sources who are cited, who gets a chance to speak, what places, what experts are really there, right? And I think all of that also just makes you better at what you do, even if the news is not necessarily related to how you spend your 9 to 5, but the things that we care about overall. So I think taking that deeper level helps.
Yeah. And while all of you are here in DC, I think it's a really spectacular opportunity for you to attend so many of the events that are around town, right? Like tonight, but also Center for American Progress, CSIS, there's Hill hearings. You're hearing directly from experts, from politicians at a direct, it's a primary source, right? Like you can't get more direct than that. And that's a very unique offering here. So take what you will from that, take the most from that. And then coming back to Mary's point about like political involvement, I mean, really that local element is something that I think we overlook too often. The national politics is there. It's hard to like realize or think about or dream about change at the big level, right? I think we are all feeling that, and when we are frustrated with our national politics. But the local politics is very malleable. It's very changeable. That is where if you are really passionate and you can rally a group of people, you can topple, you can change, you can put yourself in the arena. And it's just something that I think not enough of us like consider. When people show up en masse to a city council meeting or to a school board meeting, like they are heard. They cannot be not heard, because those folks that are sitting behind the dais like us tonight aren't used to having people in the audience, frankly, right? So when 300 people show up about one specific issue or a controversy that is affecting the community, like it has a large impact and often captures media attention for that cycle. Okay, we're gonna keep jumping because we do have time for questions. And so as we come around, like write them down so you don't forget and we get to them. And feel free to direct them to a specific panelist or to the panel. But I'm gonna pop over back to kind of our public service, and thinking about like identity. And the question really surrounds, how do we bridge, right, like our being part of the AA and HPI community and some of the work we do. And the answer might not be like, I don't think about it as much, or this is how I think about it, or it's entirely encompassing. So it can range. I want to make sure the panel doesn't feel pressured into an answer. But the question is, how do we bridge, identity, the work we do, and why it's important to, continue to advocate for equity in these spaces? I will start with Jeremiah.
Yeah. So some of the places that foreign service folks serve in are in countries with people who rarely see Americans. And I think it's important to note, because I might be that first American that they meet. And if not, I'm probably the first Filipino American at that. And so I like to think that I bridge that by every day reminding myself that every day and an encounter is an opportunity to show the diversity of the US. And that I think is a large part of public service, is being able to show my perspective. In my case, again, I'm Filipino. My parents are also immigrants, and sharing that story and being able to resonate other folks' interests in, say, coming to the United States, whether it's through study abroad, whether it's through immigration. I think having that is super important for me, and that's part of the reason why I joined the Foreign Service, is to show folks that there is the diversity in the United States.
Thanks, Jeremiah. Tom?
So, I mean, to echo what Jeremiah was saying, oftentimes I'm always having to kind of defend or like represent myself as either the only woman in the room or the only person of color. And overseas as well, I've had so many experiences where TSA has questioned why I have a diplomatic passport, because, it must be my father being in the military. It must be my husband being in the foreign service, but it could never be me as my own individual self, And if I ever walk down the street with a white man in Thailand, of course, I'm either an escort hooker or, his wife. So there's always this perception and assumption of who I am based on my ANHPI identity. And so I always feel like I have to be the one that tries to debunk that, right? But it's hard, because I will say, as outspoken as I tend to be sometimes, when you are faced with a situation like that, when someone is telling you a racist joke, or touching you inappropriately, or anything that, it puts you in a really uncomfortable position, my defense mechanism is actually to shut down, and I don't do anything. And I feel like that then kind of perpetuates, the stereotype that they do. So I really have had to try to train myself to present myself in a way that will stop those actions from happening again, because I don't want my silence to mean that it's okay and that they'll do it to someone else next time. So I do think it is hard, and especially if you are trying to present a face of America that most people haven't seen before. But you have to be there and you have to be in the room to change those perceptions, or they'll continue to persist. And they persist anyway, but I think it's important that you step up and try to show them, you know, like what the real America really is about, and it is about diversity.
I think so.
I can jump in. Yeah. You know, I'll say in the philanthropic sector, there's a dearth of representation of AAPIs. You know, generally jobs in the sector are harder to come by. It's not particularly growing. And so for our team, it's been really important to make sure that we're getting, in particular, women of color in these jobs. So I think 80% of my team are women of color, and about half are API women, including me. And so, you know, we've got a small team, but that's not insignificant, especially because philanthropy jobs often tend to be better paying than jobs in the nonprofit sector, sort of somewhere in between with federal government. And so I think that practically that has some implications for our ability to sustain ourselves in the long run too. And so I take that role and responsibility really seriously, both internal to the organization and externally. And so I feel like I've become this stronger proponent of working in the sector than I ever expected, because it can be a really helpful pathway for folks that maybe are struggling to make ends meet and can't sustain the lifestyles that they want, need, and frankly deserve in sectors that are lower paying, that often are in public service. So I think it's a really tricky balance, and I'm being pretty vulnerable and honest in my own assessment. So I hope you'll stick with me through that. But it is important to have that representation. And then strategically in our grant making, that translates as well. When we're prioritizing funding women of color led and supported organizations in our gender justice work and in our reproductive health work, part of that is because of who makes up the staff on the team, and how we are navigating the power dynamics internally, externally, and the responsibility that we see in stewarding philanthropic resources.
Thanks, Isha. Thanks for sharing that. All right, I have one more question for the panel. I think I'm going to toss to Hannah after that, but open to anyone who'd like to answer. And if you could go back in time, because all of us are a few years in and we've made choices and we're in different spaces, what is a piece of advice you would give to yourself when thinking about taking the dive into public service?
I think one important thing to know is just that nobody is going to advocate for you as much as yourself. And it's important to lean on to your connections, your networks, including CAPAL. I had to fit in CAPAL there. And I mean, I wouldn't have gotten the role at ARP had it not been for a CAPAL connection with another board member. And it is truly an amazing network of people who have so many talents and are in so many areas, like influencing DC and nationwide. So definitely always advocate for yourself and don't let anybody dim your light, because you have so much to offer.
And when volunteering or part of the CAPAL program, 100% of your colleagues are AA and HPI. That's fun. Reba?
Yeah, I think that if I could go back, or I guess maybe I would tell this to myself right now too, is that while it's so important to pay attention and learn about the skills that you're trying to get and the issue area that you're in, or the kind of work that you want to do, it's like 50% of the battle is really figuring out how to like be a person in this space, and thinking about how to interact with the manager, how to interact when you're in teams of people, right? Like how to manage all of those different dynamics. And I feel like that's true, I think, about any job, public service or no. And I think that, sometimes you hear about that and you don't really know exactly what that means. And I feel like I kind of came into it somewhat naively where I was like, we're all just trying to do our best. And, we're all going to submit what we need to submit. And then, we don't need to be besties, but we'll just go home and it'll all be fine. Right. And sometimes that's true. But I think sometimes there are just other power dynamics at play for a lot of reasons, oftentimes for things that are before you join an organization, right? Or like because of connections that people have prior, that can end up impacting your ability to do the work, your ability to make the connections you need, your ability to understand what's the most valuable thing that you can be doing. And I feel like I spent a lot of time at the beginning of my career just trying to realize that, trying to figure out how to navigate that space. And I think that if I had, been able to know that at the start, I might have approached the relationship building a little bit different and approached the way that I think about the teams a little bit differently. And I think that's the kind of thing that you can really only get with practice, is figuring out how to read people, figuring out how to make sure you're aligned with people who are aligned with you, and making sure that your good work is actually getting recognized. And I think that goes beyond, right, just like the issue area or the job title that you hold. I think that advice applies no matter where you end up.
That's good. That's good. So self-advocate, network, figure out relationship building. How, what you got?
I have the same actually. So I mean, it's really just about community building and not just figuring out people, but figuring out the system. So there are always kind of like key levers within the organization, be that people or processes, and being able to be really competent on that will really help you go far. So like I said, I've been a chameleon, and part of that's because I've been able to figure out those pivot points. And so I didn't do a degree in communications, but I've been in communications role. I've been in different things because I learned from the mentors that have taught me. I learned how to kind of play the game, so to say, and be able to get to the places I need to get to. But also having that community is really important, because you do need someone to talk to when there are frustrating aspects of your job or personal life, and you want people within your community to be able to support you and relate to you. And if it doesn't exist, build it yourself. So when I was at the Department of Interior, they didn't have an API employer resource group. So I actually co-founded the very first one, because I said, so Interior has probably one of the lowest percentages of having ANHPI. They do have higher tribal members because of, the historical way that Interior works and the Bureau of Indian Affairs is there. But ANHPI reputation is really low. And so I founded the very first organization to actually do that. And it was, a very small group at first, but it continued to grow, because once you build something, people will come. And so don't let the absence of something means that, you give up. Like, fill in that space with what you want it to look like.
Very well said. Isha?
Yeah, I think Marian, Tao, and Ariba have covered a lot of the advice that I would give. I think I would go back to the mentors piece, sort of not just finding your people and folks that you can really rely on sort of laterally, which I think CAPAL does a great job of, but identifying sort of where some of your own gaps are in understanding the sector or wanting to explore, and then not being afraid to reach out and ask for that support. Generally, people are really willing and often able to give it. And I've had some of the best conversations and best learnings about myself through some of those conversations.
Thank you for bringing mentors back. Jeremiah?
So I went into public service immediately after graduating from undergrad, but I always like to think about what life would be like on the other side in regards to, say, the private sector, or another side like local government, as we mentioned earlier, just to have a comparison and see the breadth of experiences and definitions and opportunities in public service out there. So this is to say that the one piece of advice I'd probably give myself is to be open to what those definitions are, because acts or missions or values in public service aren't locked to formal institutions. You can craft and find your own public service experience at a number of companies and organizations, public or not.
500%. That's a great way to transition. And I'll stall as Hannah walks up here. So self-advocate, network, find community, figure out how to find community, workplace, and relationship build, find and build your mentor networks, and be open to your public service journey. It could look very different than what you think it does right now. Where do you have?
All right, thank you so much. First of all, let's give a huge round of applause for our panelists. Thank you, everybody. So before we head into the Q&A, we're going to take a quick 5-minute attendee survey. So for our in-person attendees, we'll be handing out paper copies of the survey. We'll probably just hand each row one if you guys want to pass it down. And then for our virtual attendees, we'll be dropping a link in the chat box for you guys to fill out. After the survey, we'll be heading into our Q&A session. And so for our virtual attendees, if you have any questions, drop them in the chat box. For our in-person attendees, if you want to raise your hand, we'll have mic runners on the side and we'll hand you the microphone.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. Everyone doing good? You're doing great. So there's some virtual questions. I think Hannah's going to read them so that we can all hear, and then we'll take questions live from the audience too. Yeah.
All right, so as folks are filling out the survey, we'll start taking questions from our virtual audience and then we'll shift over to our in-person attendees. So the first question that we have is from Keanu, and he says, I have a question for Jeremiah. Were you able to pursue your current job from the Internship Pathways program or another way?
Yeah, good question. So I did not pursue my current job through the internship program at the State Department, through the Pathways program, like capital P. I did it through a pipeline program, so lowercase p, so not a formal program, or not a formal official name, such as pipeline, but it is a sort of I guess like agreements where folks, again, in exchange for tuition and living expenses, can get into the job after graduating, called the Foreign Affairs IT Fellowship, FAIT. And it's similar to the Pickering and Ringel that most folks are familiar with. We're just newer. There's also a newer one called the Clark Fellowship. Those are for folks interested in diplomatic security, aka the law enforcement part of the State Department. And then I think there's a new one called the Foreign Agricultural Service Fellowship, which is for folks interested in the Foreign Agricultural Service. And so there's many ways to get into the Foreign Service. These are the ones that have funding and like a guaranteed job after graduation. And so it's not through the formal internship program, although there are internships embedded in the fellowship programs, but these programs are all part of a pipeline into the Foreign Service.
Right, perfect. Thank you so much. So we'll take one more question from the virtual audience before we hand it over to our in-person attendees. And this question is from Akiko, and she says, thank you all for sharing your experiences. I was wondering, as working with other AAPIs in a predominantly white space or industry is generally a space for affinity and mutual support, whether you have ever experienced disagreement with other AAPIs and how to navigate that while acknowledging your shared and unique struggles and identities. And so this is a question that's open to all of our panelists.
Any power struggles, Tao, from when you got through?
I mean, I don't really work with APIs as much because it's an overseas environment. So,
Yeah.
I've worked with like Asians overseas, but it's not the same, I think, cultural experience. But I mean, I think it's, personalities are everywhere. And those personalities, sometimes are tied to your identity and others are tied to, different things. And so I think it's similar to how you navigate different things is you just have to learn how to work with people, because that's part of every single job, is to work with people. And so I think regardless of whether they're A and HPI or not, there is, I think, a skill set in interpersonal relationship that is important. It is tougher, obviously, I think if there is that, aspect where you have, a shared identity. And so it's a really tough question because I think it's hard to answer, from like generic standpoint, because I haven't done as much with that, but I would just say, yeah, from a conflict like management perspective, there's always another side to the story. And it's hard to just always assume, that what other people are thinking. And so it's always coming with, some humility to kind of learning and understanding. And it happens, like both in a cultural aspect as well as a interpersonal relationship aspect when you're working with someone in a team-based environment.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, I think that's the signal to open up to the audience. What questions we got? Over here, you want to give us your name, where you're interning, and then question? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Angel. I'm a CAPAL intern for the summer. I'm originally from Vancouver, Canada, but I go to school in California. I am currently interning with Asian American Lead, which is a youth empowerment education nonprofit, which is super exciting, very cool. And really enjoying my time there. I have a question about kind of the sustainability of working in nonprofit, especially as I'm currently interning with a nonprofit organization. I've heard a lot about how, especially with like compensation issues and like benefits and stuff, obviously like the pay is not as high as if you were working in like the private sector, right? And so like a lot of the conversations I've been having with like even the staff working there is that they don't necessarily see the work as sustainable long term, because at a certain point it feels like they're paying to go to work and that they're expected to do the work and go above and beyond what's expected of them because of the values and the missions of the organization. And while it is very fulfilling and meaningful, it's like a toll on them financially, right? Logistically, et cetera, and like burnout and all that. So my question is kind of, how do you combat the burnout that comes with that and like the burden that comes with like the expectations of having to take on all of these responsibilities and work oftentimes outside of your job description solely because of the mission and the values, but also in terms of nonprofit sector and like the whole nonprofit industry, like are there tangible kind of actions to increase the sustainability of nonprofit work to encourage people to go into nonprofit, and kind of like, especially for those like working government, like what is government doing to kind of ensure that the demand for nonprofit is still there and that people are able to go into that type of work without having to worry solely about like the financial burdens that come with it?
Great question. Really well put. I'm stalling to find a panelist to answer.
I guess I could start, but I felt all of that in my body. So I think I've worked at nonprofits anywhere that from like a really startup-y one to like AOP is probably the biggest one I worked out of. And for the burnout factor, I think it's just acknowledging that it's not all on you as a staff and really setting those boundaries early on. Like, yes, I'm willing to do XYZ, but at a certain point, you have to cut it off for your own mental health and for the health of the organization. And I've seen a lot of organizations struggle with having growth struggles too. So I think there's always going to be growing pains within the nonprofit sector. And there's, I feel like a lot of imagination that has to happen with both diversifying where the money sources are coming from and really looking beyond what the traditional pathways are. So that's just a start.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think that a union is good. So if you work in a place that can unionize, I've worked in places that have unions. I've been part of them. I haven't been part of them. Honestly, I have found them to be a really great place to be able to talk about what salaries look like, what benefits look like, all those like practical logistical things that are seen as very taboo. I feel like at every job I've been at, we've all been like, so how much are you getting paid? Like, what's going on? Like, I feel like I've gotten really lucky. People are very open about it, and it's helped you to advocate for yourself when it comes time to ask for a raise. Now you know like what number is reasonable to ask for. And I think I've gotten really lucky to be in an environment like that. I also think saying no is a skill set, and like my job is 9 to 6, and at 6 I'm gone. 5:30, I'm gone. Like, I'm like, okay, if we're done, we're done, right? And like, unless I'm on deadline or there's something timely coming up, I think it's totally okay to even if you're doing something that's like so important to your values or something that you really care about, I still think that going on vacation, taking your PTO, all of those things are something that I feel like as, a woman of color in the space who's doing work that I do really care about and I am very value driven. Sometimes you're told like, oh, if you, choose something that you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And, props to people who feel that. I'm so happy for them. I feel like I'm at work when I'm at work personally. And so I think it's okay to say, oh, there's like this extra project. I could totally take it on, but also I could not take it on, and that's all right too. And I think that as it's easier to do that as you get further along in your career, I think. And there is a lot to be said for, being the person who takes initiative or takes on a new project or something that's scary, especially in the early stages. But I really think saying no is a skill set. It's something to practice. And having a supportive manager, a supportive team is always more helpful than not. I think joining a union, I think being transparent about your salaries and benefits, and I think being really flexible about what you're willing to do is really important. I feel like I have a lot of friends and peers who, maybe do nonprofit work for a couple years and then are like, I need to make more money because I have a lot of things I need to do and money is required for all of it. And sometimes that means you have to leave a job that maybe in your head, you're like, oh, I need to be here for 5 or 6 years. I haven't put in the time. It's okay to look for other things. And sometimes that's the best way, especially if you're not maybe in a career where there's like a very clear promotion schedule or something like that. And so those are some of the beginner steps, I think. But to me, that's like a tension that always kind of exists. I don't really have like an answer for how to not feel it.
Thanks, Rima.
I agree. Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say really quickly, I 100% agree, but also think broadly about the the values you have because there's other organizations that probably have those same values. It's not just because of one nonprofit that you're employed at really aligns with what you're looking for doesn't mean there aren't like a couple of others that you can switch over to if they offer a compensation package or a work-life balance that is more attractive and more fitting for you or your family. So look less into the formal name of the organization or the institution and more into, again, what these nonprofits have in common, which is that value or this mission that happens to align with yours as well.
Oh, I was just going to add to your kind of small second part of the question. The federal government's not doing anything about that. So that's not where you should go to look for answers. But I agree with the setting boundaries part because I do think that it's important to be clear, and I've done it within my own team as a supervisor, is if I take a mental health day, I will tell them I'm taking a mental health day instead of just saying that I'm sick. I mean, like, I have worked a lot and I just need to take a day off because I do want to normalize that in the team environments that people feel comfortable when they are burned out to go ahead and take what is, due to them. But the other aspect is that's also why I'm in the government because it's not competitive to the private sector, but it does come with benefits. And it does, from a federal government standpoint, it's almost like it's one job that you can always change around. So even though I've moved from different departments, I keep, like my same retirement account. I keep my leave bank account when I move from department to department, but I get to move around to support my career promotion or to find a job that may, be better suited for the hours that I want to work. And so that movement and the flexibility that is afforded in the federal government is the reason why I've stayed, because I haven't worked in the nonprofit, but with USAID, we worked with nonprofit as, in providing grants to them. And so I have seen the same, kind of burnout and issues you're talking about. And with some federal government positions like the Foreign Service, because it's in such high demand, people do abuse the motivation of those who are joining the agencies. And I've seen that with the National Park Service. I've seen that with the Foreign Service. And it does need to stop, but it does take a cultural shift in order to make it happen.
Next question.
And I'll just name that philanthropy actually has a role to play in addressing nonprofit burnout. So on my team at Schusterman, we make general operating support grants. So our partners can use them for anything that they deem fit, not just projects. And we also don't really look at overhead costs, which is where a lot of the staff benefits, staff PTO, et cetera, wellness, programs come from. And then we're also adding a capacity building and wellness component to our grant making to support that. So I think that actually, if federal government doesn't have a role, philanthropy has a role to play. And, in the past few years, there's been a big shift in naming that, and particularly with COVID, naming that, understanding that, and then identifying ways where our dollars that we're able to invest can go a longer way. And then similarly, philanthropy is an option within public service that sort of has some of the benefits and job security and compensation that's a little bit closer to the private sector, but can offer some of the same, I call it heart work, or maybe not quite the same, but some threads of the same heart work and fulfillment that folks might find in the sector. So this is not an invitation for everyone to jump ship, but just to think more broadly and creatively about different points in your life where the nonprofit work is super fulfilling, maybe not as fulfilling in a different era of your personal life, and then it's always something that you can come back to. So it's both a personal experience, but also, to Mary's point, a really systemic issue that the whole industry faces.
Thanks, Isha. Audience questions.
Hi, my name is Hannah, and I'm an intern at APIA Vote. And first of all, thank you for being a speaker here. I found your answers very insightful and helpful. And the first part of my question is kind of more directed specifically towards Jeremiah. But so you were kind of a tech-related job in foreign affairs. So how is that job kind of different from a tech job in a company? And how much does your job involve like knowledge about foreign affairs? But then also, I guess, for all the other speakers, like what professional or academic experience helped you really figure out what you wanted to do and then helped you in your career?
Yeah, so working in a tech role in a non-tech organization is super different from working in a tech role in a tech organization, because all of my colleagues are folks who look to me for all of the tech answers. We have at every or almost every consulate and embassy, there is also like a medical person or a medical presence. Everyone goes to that medical person for all of their medical related questions, just like everyone comes to me for all of my tech related questions. We have an engineer or architect at every single embassy and consulate, so everyone goes to them for their. So this is one of those experiences where, in a roundabout way, the tech person isn't going again to the Microsoft or Googles of the world. They're going into the public sector, public service, where they know and acknowledge that they will be that subject matter expert. And then to your other question, what my I think it was what my background was, or what my academic.
I believe it was
Sorry.
Professional or academic experience that inspired your what you're doing now.
So I mentioned earlier, I did a major switch. I used to be an econ major, and I switched into computer science. And the practical answer is I turned 26 and I lost my health insurance from my parents. And so I needed it to, I was really getting scared and I was going to lose my health insurance and prospects for getting a job. So I switched to computer science, but I did major in art and psychology. And so all of these sort of come together in my current role, where because I'm in a customer service oriented role, helping folks with their technical issues, being able to communicate the non-tech stuff, but communicate the tech stuff to the non-tech audience, for example, is super, super critical. But also in leadership, where I'm managing, for example, what's called our locally employed staff. That just means folks in the country that you're serving in who are working in consulate or embassy. I think having not just my tech background to talk the talk of my job, but also being able to communicate how to troubleshoot, how to walk through a certain problem together. So at the end of the day, you are solving these issues for folks who come to you expecting to have the answer or the solution for their issue.
Thanks, Jeremiah. All right, I think this is a good place to like wrap things. So I wanna end us with a few things. I want to end where we started. We asked the audience, what does public service mean to you? And the answers you gave us many answers, but the ones that were big on the screen were community, advocacy, representation, and compassion. And I think through the stories of our panelists tonight and the experiences, we've done our best to touch on each of those. We hope you found this a very valuable experience. Our kickoff for the WLP series, there are 5 more coming your way. Next week's session will be about food security, agriculture, and the environment on June 26th. We'll talk about sustainability initiatives, and particularly the agricultural field and how that pertains to the AA and HPI community. And that location for that, are we back here? That makes sense because it's agriculture. We're going to be at USDA. So we're mixing it up. Join us next week for that. I really want to thank the mayor's office for helping us fund this program. I want to thank AAPIA Vote for sending a contingent to join us today, our CAPAL scholars and interns. We have Emil, who's an alumni board member. We have Zarna, who's our treasurer on the board. I point them out because we're heading into a mingling networking hour, so you need to know who to talk to. Again, Shama, Hannah, our superstar staff and our volunteers. And one more time, thank you to Jeremiah, to Isha, to Ariba, to Mary, to Tao for being our wonderful panelists tonight. Everyone, thanks so much for coming. Stick around for some mingling, and we'll see you next week. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jeremiah.
Hope that's like a show host.
We're gonna talk to you. Bye.
I was like, oh, I'm so I can't compete with him.